Nun followed a married man to Egypt. 3 months later, only her body was found. True crime. The last photograph ever taken of Sister Mary Collins showed her standing outside Cairo International Airport on a blazing August morning in 2023, her familiar nun's habit replaced by a modest blue dress and headscarf, her face radiant with what appeared to be joy, but would later be recognized as the dangerous euphoria of someone whose judgment had been completely compromised by months of sophisticated psychological manipulation. The 32-year-old woman who had spent 12 years in devoted service to God and her Boston convent had become unrecognizable, not only in her appearance but in the fundamental transformation of values and priorities that had led her to abandon her sacred vows for what she believed was a divine call to a different kind of love and service in a foreign land. 3 months later, her body would be discovered in the Mokattam Hills outside Cairo, buried in a shallow grave that suggested hasty concealment rather than reverent interment, the victim of a crime that would expose the deadly consequences of exploiting religious faith and spiritual longing for predatory purposes. The woman who had dedicated her adult life to prayer, charity, and contemplation had instead become another casualty of Omar El-Sayed, a married Egyptian businessman whose sophisticated understanding of religious psychology had enabled him to identify and exploit the spiritual and emotional vulnerabilities of Western women seeking deeper meaning and connection in their lives. The transformation that led Sister Mary from the peaceful cloisters of St. Catherine's Convent in Boston to an unmarked grave in the Egyptian desert had begun 18 months earlier, during a period of intense spiritual crisis that had been triggered by the death of her beloved mentor, Sister Margaret, whose guidance and friendship had provided the emotional anchor that made convent life bearable despite Mary's increasing sense that her calling might be incomplete or misdirected. The grief and questioning that followed Sister Margaret's passing created psychological vulnerabilities that Mary was spiritually and emotionally unprepared to recognize or address through the traditional channels of prayer and confession that had previously sustained her faith. The online spiritual community that Mary discovered during her search for comfort and meaning beyond the limitations of her convent's intellectual resources appeared to be a providential answer to her prayers for deeper understanding and connection with other souls who shared her commitment to serving God through love and sacrifice. The Interfaith Dialogue website, where she first encountered Omar, presented itself as a platform for meaningful exchange between Christians, Muslims, and others seeking common ground in their spiritual journeys, creating an environment where Mary's scholarly background and theological training made her a valued contributor to discussions about faith, service, and the universal human longing for divine connection. Omar's initial messages to Mary were masterpieces of psychological manipulation that combined profound respect for her religious commitment with subtle suggestions that her current path might be limiting her potential for serving God's greater purposes in a world that desperately needed bridges between different faith traditions and cultures. His knowledge of Christian theology and his apparent sincere desire to learn from her spiritual insights created a sense of intellectual and spiritual partnership that filled the emotional void left by Sister Margaret's death, while also appealing to Mary's suppressed desires for recognition and meaningful impact beyond the invisible boundaries of convent life. The months of intensive correspondence that developed between Mary and Omar were carefully orchestrated to exploit her specific psychological and spiritual needs, while gradually undermining her commitment to her vows and her community through subtle but persistent suggestions that God might be calling her to a different kind of service that would require courage, faith, and willingness to sacrifice familiar comforts for higher purposes that only she was equipped to fulfill. His messages combined romantic language with religious imagery in ways that made her growing attachment to him seem spiritually justified, rather than recognizing it as the systematic manipulation of someone who understood exactly how to exploit religious devotion for predatory purposes. The crisis of faith that Mary experienced during this period was intensified by her inability to discuss her doubts and attractions with her sisters or Mother Superior Agnes, whose traditional approach to spiritual direction seemed inadequate for addressing the complex emotions and questions that Omar's correspondence had awakened in her previously settled religious life. The isolation and secrecy that surrounded her relationship with Omar created additional guilt and confusion that further destabilized her judgment, while making her increasingly dependent on his guidance and validation for understanding her spiritual condition and God's will for her future. The decision to leave the convent was presented by Omar as a test of faith, comparable to Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac or Mary Magdalene's courage in following Christ, despite social condemnation and family opposition, creating a narrative framework that allowed Mary to interpret her abandonment of religious vows as spiritual obedience, rather than recognizing it as the culmination of months of systematic psychological manipulation designed to exploit her deepest beliefs and commitments for criminal purposes. Mother Superior Agnes's attempts to counsel Mary during her final weeks at the convent were frustrated by the younger woman's increasing secretiveness and her apparent conviction that her sisters could not understand the divine calling that was leading her away from traditional religious life toward what she believed was a more authentic and impactful form of Christian service that would require cultural adaptation and personal sacrifice in the service of interfaith understanding and evangelization. The farewell that Mary took from her convent community was emotionally devastating for sisters who had watched her spiritual and intellectual growth for over a decade, though none of them fully understood that they were witnessing not a genuine calling to missionary work, but rather the final stage of a predatory scheme that would ultimately cost Mary her life through exploitation of the very faith, devotion that had defined her identity since her early 20s. The arrival of Sister Mary Collins in Cairo represented the culmination of Omar el-Sayed's 18-month campaign to lure her away from the safety of her Boston convent, though the reality that awaited her bore no resemblance to the interfaith ministry and romantic partnership that had been promised through months of carefully crafted correspondence, designed to exploit her spiritual yearnings and emotional vulnerabilities. The airport reception included none of the welcoming committee of fellow Christians and Muslims that Omar had described, only Omar himself and a hired driver whose presence seemed to make even casual conversation impossible during the drive through Cairo's chaotic streets. The accommodation that had been arranged for Mary was a modest apartment in a residential district, far from the city center, presented as temporary housing, while Omar finalized arrangements for the Interfaith Center, where she would supposedly begin her missionary work among Cairo's Christian and Muslim communities. The isolation of the location and the absence of the religious community that had been promised became immediately apparent, though Mary initially interpreted these discrepancies as evidence of the challenges facing interfaith work in a predominantly Muslim country, rather than recognizing them as deliberate elements of a systematic captivity scheme. The first weeks of Mary's stay in Cairo were characterized by increasing confusion and disappointment, as the promised meetings with local religious leaders were repeatedly postponed due to what Omar claimed were political sensitivities and bureaucratic complications that required careful navigation to avoid jeopardizing the entire interfaith project that depended on his established relationships within Cairo's religious and business communities. The gradual realization that Omar's claims about his connections and influence had been substantially exaggerated was accompanied by growing anxiety about her financial dependence on someone whose character seemed increasingly different from the spiritual seeker she had believed she was partnering with. The revelation that Omar was married came not through honest disclosure, but through Mary's accidental encounter with his wife Layla during a shopping trip to a local market, creating a crisis of faith and judgment that forced Mary to confront the possibility that everything Omar had told her about his personal circumstances and spiritual motivations had been systematically fabricated to exploit her trust and religious commitment. The confrontation that followed this discovery revealed aspects of Omar's personality that had been carefully concealed during their correspondence, including a violent temper and possessive attitude that transformed him from spiritual partner to dangerous captor. The isolation that Omar imposed on Mary following her discovery of his marriage was presented as necessary protection from cultural misunderstandings and religious conflicts that could endanger both her safety and the interfaith project that required discretion and careful timing to succeed in Cairo's complex social and political environment. The systematic removal of her independence and communication with the outside world was accomplished through a combination of financial control, cultural intimidation, and emotional manipulation that exploited her unfamiliarity with Egyptian society and her continuing hope that their relationship might still serve God's purposes despite the deception that had brought her to Cairo. Emily Parker, Mary's childhood friend, who had maintained sporadic contact despite Mary's religious vocation, became increasingly concerned about the dramatic changes in Mary's communication patterns and the vague explanations she received about the interfaith work that had supposedly justified such a dramatic departure from religious life. The email that Emily received in late October was the last communication from Mary that seemed to reflect her authentic voice and concerns. "Pray for me. I fear I've made a mistake." The psychological manipulation that Omar employed during this period was designed to maintain Mary's emotional dependence while systematically breaking down her sense of independent judgment and spiritual authority that had previously enabled her to navigate complex moral and practical decisions through prayer, reflection, and consultation with trusted religious advisors who were no longer accessible to her in her isolated Egyptian circumstances. The physical abuse that began as punishment for Mary's attempts to contact her convent or arrange independent return travel to Boston escalated over the following weeks to include systematic violence that was justified through distorted interpretations of both Christian and Islamic teachings about female submission and the necessity of accepting suffering as part of God's plan for spiritual purification and growth. The medical attention that Mary required following particularly severe episodes of abuse was provided by private physicians who were either complicit in Omar's criminal activities or intimidated into silence through threats, financial incentives that ensured her injuries would not be reported to authorities who might investigate her circumstances or provide assistance for escaping her increasingly dangerous situation. The attempts that Mary made to seek help from local Christian communities were thwarted by Omar's connections within Cairo's expatriate networks and his ability to present her as a mentally unstable foreign woman who had abandoned her religious vows and was making false accusations against a respected businessman who was trying to help her adjust to life outside the convent while managing her psychological problems. Call to action. Diese tragische Geschichte siegt. We glaube und vertrauen zur tödlichen Falle werden können. Wenn Sie lernen möchten, wie Sie sich und andere vor solchen perfiden Manipulationen schützen können, abonnieren Sie unseren Kanal und aktivieren Sie die Benachrichtigungen. Denn manchmal sind die gefährlichsten Raubtiere diejenigen, die unsere edelsten Eigenschaften ausnutzen. The systematic destruction of Sister Mary's psychological defenses accelerated during her second month in Cairo, as Omar's control mechanisms evolved from subtle manipulation to overt threats that made clear her complete dependence on his goodwill for basic survival in a country where she had no legal status, financial resources, or social connections that could provide assistance if she attempted to resist his increasingly dangerous demands and restrictions on her freedom and communication with the outside world. The financial exploitation that accompanied the psychological abuse included Omar's appropriation of the modest savings that Mary had accumulated during her years of convent life, funds that she had withdrawn to support what she believed would be her interfaith missionary work, but which were instead used to finance Omar's personal expenses and maintain the lifestyle that enabled him to continue his predatory activities targeting vulnerable Western women who could be lured to Egypt through religious and romantic manipulation. The isolation from her religious community became complete when Omar intercepted and destroyed letters from Mother Superior, Agnes, and other sisters who were attempting to maintain contact and offer support for what they hoped was a legitimate, if misguided, attempt to serve God in a different cultural context. The severance of these spiritual lifelines was particularly devastating for Mary, whose entire adult identity had been built around her relationship with her religious community, and whose psychological stability depended on the prayers and guidance of women who had shared her commitment to faith and service. The cultural barriers that Omar exploited to maintain his control included his intimate knowledge of Egyptian social customs and legal systems that could be manipulated to portray Mary as an unstable foreign woman whose presence in the country was problematic for his family and business reputation, creating narratives that would discourage official investigation if she disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances that could be attributed to mental illness or cultural maladjustment. Detective Hassan Mahmoud of the Cairo police first became aware of Mary's situation through reports from concerned expatriate Christians who had encountered her during her brief attempts to seek help from local churches. though his initial inquiries were discouraged by superior officers who emphasized the importance of avoiding complications with prominent local businessmen whose family connections and financial influence could create political problems for the department. The escalation to serious physical violence occurred when Mary discovered evidence of Omar's other relationships with foreign women who had been lured to Cairo through similar romantic and religious manipulation, leading to a confrontation that revealed the systematic nature of his predatory activities and her own expendability within his criminal enterprise that had been operating for years without serious interference from law enforcement or social services. The medical crisis that would eventually lead to Mary's death began with what appeared to be a suicide attempt involving prescription medications that had been provided to treat depression and anxiety attributed to her difficulty adjusting to life outside the convent, though the circumstances surrounding her apparent overdose raised questions about whether she had been deliberately poisoned or coerced into taking substances that would cause her death while providing Omar with plausible deniability. Layla El-Sayed's role in Mary's final weeks was complex and tragic, as Omar's wife was simultaneously a victim of his controlling behavior and an unwilling accomplice in his crimes, who was too frightened of his violent retaliation to provide meaningful assistance to Mary, despite her recognition that the American woman was in mortal danger from her husband's escalating abuse and paranoid suspicions about her potential to expose his criminal activities. The investigation into Mary's disappearance was hampered by the 3-day delay between her death and the initial missing person report, time that Omar used to dispose of evidence and establish alibis, while also pressuring potential witnesses to remain silent about Mary's presence in Cairo or the circumstances of her relationship with a married businessman whose reputation and family connections provided protection from serious criminal investigation. The discovery of Mary's body in the Mokattam Hills was made by local residents who reported the presence of partially exposed human remains to police, leading to a forensic examination that revealed evidence of systematic abuse and violent death that contradicted Omar's claims that Mary had died by suicide after suffering a psychological breakdown related to her inability to adjust to life outside her American convent. The international complications that arose from investigating the death of an American religious figure created diplomatic tensions between Egyptian and American authorities, with Egyptian officials emphasizing respect for local jurisdiction and cultural sensitivities, while American representatives demanded thorough investigation and accountability for crimes that had victimized a United States citizen who had been lured to Egypt through systematic deception and manipulation. The arrest of Omar El-Sayed required careful coordination between Detective Mahmoud and international law enforcement agencies, as Omar's family connections and business relationships provided him with advance warning of police interest and opportunities to destroy evidence, while also preparing legal defenses that would minimize his culpability for Mary's death and the systematic abuse that had preceded her murder. The search of Omar's properties revealed extensive evidence of his predatory activities, including correspondence with multiple Western women who had been targeted through religious and dating websites, detailed psychological profiles that had been developed to exploit specific vulnerabilities, and financial records showing the systematic theft of assets from victims who had trusted him with their savings and personal security during their time in Egypt. The interrogation of Omar following his arrest revealed a complex personality that combined genuine religious knowledge with complete moral indifference to the suffering he had caused to numerous women who had been attracted to his apparent spiritual sophistication and his promises of meaningful interfaith, cooperation, and romantic partnership that could serve higher purposes than conventional relationships or traditional religious vocations. The evidence that emerged during the investigation demonstrated that Mary was not Omar's first victim to die under suspicious circumstances, with at least 3 other Western women having disappeared or died during their relationships with him over a 5-year period, though their cases had been inadequately investigated due to his political connections and the cultural barriers that discouraged thorough inquiry into crimes involving prominent local men and vulnerable foreign women. The psychological evaluation conducted for Omar revealed personality disorders and narcissistic traits that enabled him to view religious women as particularly attractive targets for manipulation because their spiritual training had conditioned them to trust authority figures and interpret suffering as part of God's plan, rather than recognizing abuse as criminal behavior that required resistance and escape, rather than patience and submission. The testimony provided by former household staff who had witnessed Omar's treatment of Mary and other foreign women created a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse that contradicted his public reputation as a devout Muslim and successful businessman, revealing instead a pattern of predatory behavior that exploited religious faith and cultural differences to facilitate crimes that had been successfully concealed through wealth, political influence, and systematic intimidation of potential witnesses. The international legal proceedings required unprecedented cooperation between Egyptian and American judicial systems, creating procedural challenges that tested existing treaties while establishing new precedents for prosecuting crimes that exploited religious faith and cultural differences to facilitate systematic abuse and murder of foreign nationals who lacked local protection and support systems. Mother Superior Agnes's testimony about Mary's psychological state during her final weeks at the convent provided crucial insights into the manipulation techniques that had been employed to exploit her spiritual vulnerabilities and convince her to abandon her religious vows for what she believed was a higher calling that would enable her to serve God more effectively through interfaith ministry and cultural bridge building. Emily Parker's evidence about Mary's final communication and her obvious distress about her situation in Egypt helped establish the timeline of events leading to her death, while also demonstrating that she had recognized the danger of her circumstances and was attempting to seek help from her American support network before being silenced permanently by someone who could not allow her to expose his criminal activities. The civil litigation that accompanied the criminal proceedings enabled Mary's family and religious community to pursue financial compensation, while also establishing legal precedents for holding perpetrators accountable for crimes that exploited religious faith and cultural manipulation to facilitate systematic abuse and murder of vulnerable individuals who had been isolated from their normal support systems. The media coverage of the trial brought international attention to the phenomenon of religious exploitation and the particular vulnerabilities faced by spiritual seekers who could be targeted by sophisticated criminals who understood how to exploit faith and devotion for predatory purposes that ultimately led to systematic abuse and potential murder when victims became obstacles to continued criminal activity. The conviction of Omar El-Sayed on charges of first-degree murder represented a significant victory for international cooperation in prosecuting crimes that exploited religious faith and cultural differences, though the life sentence imposed by Egyptian courts reflected the serious nature of his crimes, while also demonstrating Egypt's commitment to justice, despite the political complications created by prosecuting a prominent member of the business community with extensive family and political connections. The asset forfeiture proceedings that followed the criminal conviction resulted in the recovery of substantial funds that had been stolen from Mary and other victims, providing some financial compensation for their families, while also establishing important legal precedents for holding wealthy criminals accountable for their systematic exploitation of vulnerable individuals who had trusted them with their spiritual and physical welfare. The international cooperation that had been essential for investigating and prosecuting Omar's crimes established new protocols for handling cases involving religious exploitation and cross-cultural manipulation, creating frameworks that would improve law enforcement responses to similar cases, while also providing better protection and support for spiritual seekers who might be vulnerable to exploitation by predators operating in international contexts. The psychological research that emerged from the case contributed to enhanced understanding of how religious faith could be exploited for criminal purposes, while also advancing knowledge about the specific vulnerabilities that made spiritual seekers attractive targets for sophisticated predators who understood how to exploit devotion and trust for systematic abuse and potential murder when victims became obstacles to continued criminal activity. The victim support services that were enhanced in response to Mary's case included specialized assistance for families of religious victims who had been exploited through their faith, addressing the unique challenges faced by religious communities, dealing with the loss of members who had been systematically manipulated and murdered by criminals who exploited their spiritual commitments and cultural naivety. The diplomatic initiatives that resulted from the case included enhanced cooperation agreements between American and Egyptian law enforcement agencies, creating systematic improvements in how cases involving American victims would be investigated and prosecuted, while also establishing better communication channels between diplomatic officials and local authorities responsible for protecting foreign nationals from criminal exploitation. The legislative changes that were prompted by the case included enhanced penalties for crimes involving religious exploitation, improved resources for international cooperation in criminal investigations involving faith-based manipulation, and strengthened victim protection services that address the unique needs of individuals who had been exploited through their spiritual commitments and religious devotion. The academic research that was inspired by the case contributed to enhanced understanding of religious exploitation, while also advancing knowledge about effective prevention strategies and therapeutic interventions for individuals and communities recovering from the loss of members who had been victimized through systematic manipulation of their faith and spiritual yearning for deeper meaning and connection. The corporate security consulting industry that emerged in response to the case provided specialized services for religious organizations and spiritual communities seeking to protect their members from predatory individuals who might target them through sophisticated understanding of religious psychology and the vulnerabilities that made spiritual seekers attractive victims for systematic exploitation. The insurance industry's response to the case included enhanced coverage options for religious organizations and their members who might be targeted by criminals specializing in faith-based exploitation, while also implementing improved risk assessment procedures that could help identify potentially dangerous situations before they resulted in serious harm to vulnerable spiritual seekers. The ongoing monitoring of similar criminal activities revealed that while Omar's specific network had been successfully prosecuted, other predators continued to operate using similar techniques while adapting their methods to avoid the detection strategies that had led to his conviction, highlighting the need for continued vigilance and international cooperation in combating faith-based criminal exploitation. The long-term recovery process for Street, Catherine's convent, and Mary's family required extensive spiritual and psychological support to help them process not only their grief over her loss, but also the complex emotions associated with her decision to abandon her. Religious vows for what proved to be a fatal relationship with someone who exploited her deepest spiritual commitments for predatory purposes that ultimately cost her life. Mother Superior Agnes's leadership during the aftermath of Mary's murder demonstrated remarkable spiritual strength and practical wisdom as she guided her community through their grief, while also working to prevent similar tragedies by enhancing their understanding of how religious devotion could be exploited by sophisticated predators who understood exactly how to manipulate spiritual yearning and faith-based vulnerabilities. The impact on the broader Catholic community was significant and lasting, creating discussions about the balance between spiritual openness and appropriate caution when engaging with individuals who claim to share religious commitments but whose true motivations might be predatory rather than genuinely spiritual or humanitarian in nature. The victim advocacy work that emerged from Mary's case included specialized support services for religious communities dealing with the loss of members to criminal exploitation, addressing the unique challenges faced by faith-based organizations whose members might be particularly vulnerable to manipulation by predators who understood how to exploit spiritual devotion and religious commitment. The educational initiatives that grew from the case included programs designed to help religious communities recognize warning signs of spiritual manipulation, while also providing practical guidance about maintaining appropriate boundaries when engaging in interfaith dialogue or international religious work that might expose vulnerable individuals to systematic exploitation. The legislative advocacy that was supported by religious organizations included enhanced protections for Americans engaged in religious work abroad, improved consular services for families of victims who had been exploited through their faith, and strengthened cooperation agreements between law enforcement agencies investigating crimes that exploited religious devotion for predatory purposes. The psychological research that continued to grow from Mary's case contributed to enhanced understanding of how spiritual vulnerabilities could be exploited by sophisticated criminals, while also advancing knowledge about effective therapeutic interventions for religious communities recovering from the loss of members who had been systematically manipulated and murdered through exploitation of their faith. The international cooperation initiatives that were supported by religious organizations included enhanced information sharing between countries about criminals who specialized in targeting spiritual seekers, while also developing protocols for protecting religious workers and volunteers who might be vulnerable to exploitation when working in international contexts where cultural and legal protections were limited. The corporate partnerships that developed around victim protection included collaborations with technology companies to develop better screening systems for religious and dating websites that might be exploited by predators targeting spiritual individuals, while also providing enhanced security services for religious organizations operating in international contexts where their members might face unique risks. The ongoing impact of Mary's case extended beyond individual justice to include systematic improvements in how religious exploitation cases were investigated and prosecuted, while also contributing to enhanced awareness about the particular vulnerabilities faced by spiritual seekers who could be targeted by sophisticated predators operating in international contexts where cultural differences and religious devotion created opportunities for systematic abuse. The memorial services and community remembrances that were organized in Mary's honor focused on celebrating her genuine spiritual commitment and desire to serve God, while also raising awareness about religious exploitation and the importance of maintaining appropriate caution when engaging with individuals who claim to offer spiritual opportunities that required abandoning established support systems and community connections. The establishment of the Sister Mary Collins Foundation represented the transformation of tragedy into meaningful advocacy for protecting vulnerable spiritual seekers from exploitation, creating a permanent institution dedicated to educating religious communities about manipulation techniques, while also supporting families who had lost loved ones to criminals who exploited faith and devotion for predatory purposes. The International Conference on Religious Exploitation that the Foundation sponsored annually brought together survivors, law enforcement officials, religious leaders, and researchers from around the world to share knowledge about criminal techniques, while also developing more effective prevention strategies and support services that address the unique challenges posed by crimes that exploited spiritual faith and religious commitment. The research initiatives that the Foundation funded contributed to enhanced understanding of religious manipulation techniques, while also advancing knowledge about effective prevention strategies and therapeutic interventions for individuals and communities who might be vulnerable to exploitation by predators who specialized in targeting spiritual seekers through sophisticated understanding of religious psychology. The victim support services that the Foundation operated included specialized counseling for families affected by religious exploitation, legal assistance for navigating complex international legal proceedings involving faith-based crimes, and practical guidance for religious communities seeking to protect their members from systematic manipulation by sophisticated predators. The educational materials that the Foundation produced provided practical information about recognizing religious manipulation, while also raising awareness about the sophisticated psychological techniques used by criminals to exploit spiritual devotion and faith-based vulnerabilities for systematic abuse and potential murder when victims became obstacles to continued predatory activity. The policy advocacy that the Foundation undertook included support for enhanced protections for Americans engaged in religious work abroad, improved cooperation between law enforcement agencies investigating faith-based crimes, and strengthened victim support services that addressed the unique challenges faced by religious communities dealing with criminal exploitation of their members. The corporate consulting services that the Foundation provided included risk assessment and safety planning for religious organizations engaged in international work, with particular focus on identifying potential dangers and developing strategies for protecting members, while pursuing legitimate spiritual and humanitarian activities in international contexts. The international cooperation initiatives that the Foundation supported included enhanced intelligence sharing between countries about criminals who specialized in religious exploitation, while also developing protocols for protecting spiritual seekers who might be targeted by sophisticated predators operating across international boundaries where cultural and legal differences created opportunities for systematic abuse. The psychological treatment protocols that were developed through Foundation research provided specialized approaches for helping religious communities recover from losses involving both spiritual manipulation and violence, while also addressing the unique challenges faced by faith-based organizations whose fundamental trust in human goodness had been violated by criminal exploitation of their spiritual commitments. The media initiatives that the foundation supported included responsible journalism guidelines for reporting on religious exploitation cases and educational documentaries that provided awareness about the risks, while also honoring the memory of victims who had been exploited through their genuine desire to serve God and help others through their spiritual gifts and commitments. The legislative achievements that resulted from the foundation's advocacy work included enhanced penalties for religious exploitation, improved victim compensation programs for faith-based crimes, and strengthened international cooperation requirements that facilitated investigation and prosecution of criminals who exploited spiritual devotion and religious commitment for predatory purposes. The 10-year anniversary of Sister Mary Collins's murder marked a significant milestone in international efforts to combat religious exploitation, with the foundation, established in her memory, having become a globally recognized leader in victim advocacy, research funding, and policy development that had contributed to meaningful improvements in protection services for spiritual seekers and law enforcement capabilities for investigating faith-based crimes. The technological innovations that had been developed through foundation-funded research included advanced screening algorithms for religious and dating websites that could identify potential predators who specialized in targeting spiritual individuals, as well as early warning systems that could help religious communities recognize dangerous manipulation patterns before they escalated to serious abuse or murder. The international law enforcement cooperation that had been essential for investigating Omar's crimes had evolved into permanent frameworks for combating religious exploitation, with specialized units in multiple countries sharing intelligence and coordinating operations that had disrupted numerous criminal networks, while also establishing protocols for protecting vulnerable spiritual seekers from systematic manipulation and abuse. The victim support services that had been enhanced in response to Mary's case continued to provide specialized assistance for individuals and communities affected by religious exploitation, while also contributing to enhanced understanding of effective therapeutic interventions that help survivors rebuild their capacity for spiritual trust and authentic faith after experiencing systematic manipulation of their religious devotion. The educational impact of Mary's story extended far beyond formal prevention programs to include widespread awareness within religious communities about the dangers of spiritual manipulation and the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries when engaging in interfaith dialogue or international religious work that might expose vulnerable individuals to exploitation by sophisticated predators. The policy changes that the Foundation's advocacy had helped achieve continued to influence victim protection measures and law enforcement cooperation, while also establishing legal precedents for prosecuting religious exploitation cases and providing compensation for families who had lost loved ones to crimes involving faith-based manipulation and systematic abuse. The psychological research that had grown out of Mary's case continued to advance understanding of how religious devotion could be exploited by criminals, while also contributing to enhanced knowledge about resilience factors and recovery strategies that could help both potential victims recognize dangerous situations and communities recover from losses involving spiritual manipulation. The corporate partnerships that the Foundation had established continued to produce innovative solutions for religious safety and security, while also supporting legitimate spiritual organizations and interfaith dialogue programs that needed to balance risk management with authentic opportunities for meaningful religious exchange and international cooperation. The diplomatic relationships that had been strengthened through Mary's case continued to facilitate beneficial cooperation between nations, while also supporting international efforts to protect spiritual seekers and religious workers from exploitation by predators who operated across cultural and legal boundaries to target vulnerable individuals. The ongoing monitoring of criminal networks revealed that while Omar's specific case had been successfully prosecuted, similar predators continued to operate using adapted techniques while exploiting new technologies and social platforms to target spiritual seekers, highlighting the continued relevance of the prevention strategies and support systems developed in response to Mary's murder. The psychological treatment protocols that had been developed through Foundation research continued to provide specialized approaches for helping religious communities recover from losses involving both spiritual manipulation and violence, while also addressing the unique challenges faced by faith-based organizations whose trust in human goodness had been violated by criminal exploitation. The transformation of Mother Superior Agnes from grieving religious leader to internationally recognized expert in religious exploitation prevention represented one of the most powerful legacies of Mary's tragic case. As the woman who had watched helplessly as her spiritual daughter was systematically manipulated, channeled her grief into meaningful work that protected other vulnerable spiritual seekers from similar predatory exploitation. The international speaking engagements that Mother Superior Agnes undertook brought unique perspectives to conferences and educational programs, where her first-hand knowledge of Mary's spiritual transformation provided insights that could not be gained through academic study alone, while also demonstrating the importance of maintaining strong spiritual community bonds that could provide objective guidance when religious devotion might be compromised by sophisticated manipulation. The research collaborations that religious leaders participated in with academic institutions contributed to enhanced understanding of the long-term impact of faith-based crimes, while also advancing knowledge about effective prevention strategies and support systems that could help religious communities protect their members from exploitation by predators who understood how to exploit spiritual vulnerabilities. The policy advocacy that had grown from their spiritual calling included support for enhanced protections for Americans engaged in religious work, improved international cooperation in cases involving faith-based crimes, and strengthened educational programs that could help spiritual seekers understand the risks associated with abandoning established religious communities for opportunities that seemed too spiritually perfect to question. The victim support network that had developed around their foundation's work provided ongoing assistance for religious communities affected by spiritual exploitation, while also creating advocacy platforms that maintained pressure for continued improvements in prevention, investigation, and prosecution of crimes that exploited religious faith and devotion for predatory purposes. The technological initiatives that the Foundation supported included development of artificial intelligence systems that could identify potential religious exploitation patterns and provide early warnings about dangerous spiritual manipulation, while also supporting legitimate interfaith dialogue by helping users distinguish between authentic and predatory religious communications. The educational materials that had been developed through their advocacy work continued to provide valuable information about recognizing religious manipulation, while also reducing stigma associated with spiritual seeking that could make individuals vulnerable to exploitation by sophisticated criminals who understood how to exploit faith and devotion for predatory purposes. The corporate partnerships that the Foundation maintained continued to produce innovative solutions for religious safety and security, while also supporting legitimate spiritual organizations that needed to balance risk management with authentic opportunities for meaningful interfaith dialogue and international religious cooperation. The psychological research that had been inspired by their case continued to advance understanding of how spiritual vulnerabilities could be exploited by predators, while also contributing to enhanced knowledge about therapeutic interventions that could help survivors rebuild their capacity for authentic spiritual community and religious trust after experiencing systematic manipulation. The ongoing impact of their advocacy work extended beyond individual protection to include systematic improvements in international cooperation, victim support, and religious exploitation prevention that continued to evolve in response to new criminal techniques, while maintaining focus on the human cost of crimes that exploited spiritual faith and religious devotion. The Memorial Scholarship Program that was established in Mary's honor provided educational opportunities for young women pursuing careers in religious studies and victim advocacy, while also supporting research into faith-based crime prevention and interfaith dialogue that could help reduce vulnerabilities that made spiritual seekers susceptible to predatory exploitation. 15 years after Sister Mary Collins left her Boston convent to follow what she believed was God's calling to interfaith ministry in Egypt, only to be murdered by the married businessman who had systematically exploited her spiritual devotion and religious commitment, her story continues to serve as both a tragic warning about the deadly consequences of religious exploitation and an inspiring example of how personal loss can be transformed into meaningful advocacy that protects other vulnerable, spiritual seekers from similar predatory victimization. The Sister Mary Collins Foundation has become an internationally recognized institution that has directly assisted over 900 religious communities while also funding research and policy initiatives that have contributed to systematic improvements in religious exploitation prevention, victim protection, and international law enforcement cooperation across multiple countries and faith traditions. The legislative changes that their advocacy helped achieve have been adopted across numerous jurisdictions and have contributed to more effective prosecution of faith-based crimes, while also providing enhanced resources for religious communities and their members, who need support navigating complex legal systems and recovery processes that are complicated by the spiritual dimensions of their victimization. The international law enforcement cooperation that was essential for investigating Omar's crimes has evolved into permanent frameworks for combating religious exploitation, with specialized units sharing intelligence and coordinating operations that have disrupted hundreds of criminal networks, while also establishing protocols for protecting vulnerable spiritual seekers from systematic manipulation and abuse. The victim support services that were enhanced in response to Mary's case continue to provide specialized assistance for individuals and communities affected by faith-based crimes, while also contributing to enhanced understanding of effective therapeutic interventions that help survivors rebuild their capacity for spiritual trust and authentic religious community after experiencing systematic exploitation of their devotion. The technological innovations that have resulted from foundation-funded research continue to provide enhanced safety tools for religious organizations and spiritual seekers, while also supporting legitimate interfaith dialogue and international religious cooperation by helping users identify potentially dangerous manipulation patterns before they escalate to serious abuse or violence. The psychological research that has grown out of Mary's case continues to advance understanding of how religious, faith, and spiritual devotion can be exploited by sophisticated predators, while also contributing to enhanced knowledge about resilience factors and prevention strategies that help potential victims recognize dangerous situations before becoming fully victimized. Mother Superior Agnes's development into a leading expert in religious exploitation prevention has provided a model for channeling spiritual grief into professional expertise that protects others, while also demonstrating the importance of maintaining strong religious community bonds that can provide objective guidance when spiritual seeking might be compromised by predatory manipulation. The ongoing impact of their advocacy work extends beyond individual protection to include systematic improvements in international cooperation, victim support, and religious crime prevention that continue to evolve in response to new criminal techniques while maintaining focus on the human cost of crimes that exploit spiritual faith and religious devotion for predatory purposes. The story of Sister Mary Collins serves as a permanent reminder that while spiritual seeking and religious devotion represent humanity's highest aspirations, these sacred commitments must be balanced with appropriate awareness of the sophisticated predators who exploit faith and devotion to facilitate devastating crimes that can destroy lives and religious communities across international boundaries. Her legacy lives on through the thousands of potential victims who have been protected by the awareness programs her community's advocacy made possible, the hundreds of religious communities that have received support through their foundation services, and the systematic improvements in law enforcement and victim protection that emerged from their comprehensive response to personal tragedy, ensuring that her death was ultimately transformed into lasting positive change that continues to benefit vulnerable spiritual seekers worldwide.